Hey, Justin.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for covering for me last week when I was out and covering for Bill this week when he is on assignment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good to be back.
Indeed. We were talking offline. It is a slow August. Augusts are supposed to always be slow, but they really aren't always. In fact, in the last couple of years, I've noticed that there's really no rest for the wicked. There's no Christmas break from tweeting and from news. They pass Obamacare bills on Christmas Eve, and there's elections going on in August that are hot. This year, though, it does seem, I feel like it's nothing happening. My office is really quiet.
Yeah, I mean, this is brutally, painfully slow, and I suppose that's fine. That's when you presume that journalists are supposed to go do our jobs and go find news and spend time reporting policy and just no. I mean, it's.
Well,
I want to go find a politician and ask him about his gaffes. That's the. Otherwise, I'm just not sure what to do.
What we should do, as one of my colleagues, Will Ron, says, we should have a pact where all journalists agree to not write during August, and we go on vacation and read books and relax and spend time with our families, because otherwise we start talking about rodeos and writing about the racial implications of rodeo clowns, and we start writing about candidates in paisley bathrobes. So.
Isn't the real crime that most Americans have probably never been to a rodeo, which are very fun? I would very much recommend that you go see one if you haven't. They're great.
I don't know that I've been to a rodeo.
Yeah. I mean,
I'd like to go to a rodeo.
Very much a product of a region. I mean, they're the American Southwest and the Great Plains, but I mean, they're pretty fun. You watch young men who are dumb enough to get on a 2,000-pound bull and get bucked around, and that's interesting. You watch people who can tackle steers, and you can watch rodeo clowns who don't get on national television. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, overall, it's a pretty fun, family-friendly experience, and you should do more. But
no, I'd love to go to a rodeo. And you mentioned rodeo clowns, and I'm reminded of Adam Carolla, who says that rodeo clowns have the lowest risk to. I'm not going to use the word he uses for females. Ratio, meaning that most jobs, if you're a football player, it's dangerous, but you get women are attracted to it. And if you're a soldier or whatever, there's always groupies. But rodeo clown is the most dangerous, risky job that has really no payoff in terms of impressing the ladies.
I don't think that's a winner at the clubs.
No, I mean, yet you're putting your life on the line all the time. It's incredibly heroic, but there's no payoff. Why would I don't get why you would do it.
For the rest.
But why would you be a rodeo clown? There's no respect, and yet it's a ton of it's very dangerous.
I mean, there's
you might as well be a
professional respect. I mean, there are cowboys like you because you save their lives and whatnot, and there is people who understand and admire rodeo culture that respect you. But no, I mean, you're not going to walk into the best club in Miami and be like, "Hey, what's up, people?" I put on makeup on my face and run around huge animals who want to kill me.
Yeah.
That's not. Exactly
I feel like they're better investments. If you're willing to put your life on the line and get beat up, you should at least get the fringe benefits of it. And there's not a lot of respect for the rodeo clowns. But so. There's not a lot going on, but we still find, things to talk about. And I alluded to the paisley bathrobe story.
Which ran at my former employer. I was pretty amused to read it. Patricia
the
Murphy
Daily Beast
threw a thing up there which had, I think it had on record quotes from 4 people, 2 of whom praised him, one of whom was concerned about his ideological rigidity, and then one of whom who is a Hollywood screenwriter who has written and directed some of the worst movies of all time.
Right.
Called him creepy
said frankly
that he was a bad person. So
yeah, and they buried the lead. That could have been a story unto itself. How his college roommate was, the purveyor of some of the worst movies ever made.
Right. Well, they didn't mention that he was the director of The Hangover 3, which is probably the worst. I mean, if you want to go through movies that should have never been made, and for which if you make them, you should probably lose your citizenship as an American, that's probably the first thing that I would nominate. I mean, and Sonny Bunch wrote something great at the pretty beginning. He just casually listed the 5, and just that's it. Because like you're quoting this guy with neglecting to mention. I'm sorry, you're quoting a guy on his life experience at Princeton with a person who graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, and then went on to clerk for a Supreme Court judge. Quoting him, smashing on this guy, when the person you're quoting he directed The Hangover 3. That is the worst and should be banned. I mean, it's definitely buried the lead. Sort of a slimy hook angle. You quote one guy saying that he didn't like his freshman roommate. Wow, that's congratulations.
Right.
You found.
Well, the movie's number one. They're nowhere near as bad as Jack Abramoff's Red Scorpion. So let's give him that. But look, Tom Bevan over at Real Clear Politics. And by the way, I used to work with Patricia was a coworker at Politics Daily. But Tom Bevan really went after her and said the Daily Beast piece on Cruz represents a new low for the genre and for modern political journalism. That's a tough hit.
Ouch.
Do you think it was deserving of that much scorn?
I personally am a huge fan of hit pieces. They're fun to read and they're enjoyable. There's usually some interesting quotes and you can sort of laugh and smirk. And it's a hit piece aiming at 2016. It dropped in August of 2013. So I imagine the 25 people that read it probably are really going to retain that going into the primaries for the GOP. But I don't think it was the worst thing I've ever seen. There's been some, in the annals of like the most vile and ruthless hit pieces, this was pretty tame. It was just sort of, I think it was just amusing to see, again, that a guy hated his freshman year roommate and was willing to say that in public. A person who I would presume has substantial political differences from Ted Cruz. So,
right. Well, look, I agree. I have the whole don't hate the play, I hate the game philosophy. I mean, I think Patricia was doing kind of what you get paid to do in August, and she actually took the time to do a little vetting. It might have been nice if some reporters had done this on Barack Obama, but and look, I think they were guilty of playing up the Paisley robe thing. If you read the story, most of the story was really about, oh yeah, he was a smart guy. He hasn't really changed. He was a great debater.
He's sort of like a type A jerk who ran roughshod over people and wasn't concerned about it and believed in the same things he did at 17 as he does today. Right. And then the Paisley bathrobe, which was sort of just hanging out there. Of course, people pulled it out because it does seriously make me question his qualification to be president, because Paisley is terrible and should be banned. So, but otherwise, the fact that he it was courteous of him to wear a bathrobe when going around a co-ed dorm, because it obviously would have been rude for him to be naked or in less than a bathrobe. But it was just the creepy. I think some in the headline was sort of strong, but it's fine. It's a hit piece.
I think some of the thing going on with Cruz, and I hate stupid disclaimers, but now my light is on. I used to work with Patricia. My wife used to consult for Cruz, and it's really irrelevant. But if I don't say it, somebody could accuse me of showing favoritism or whatever. But you can't avoid Cruz. I assumed that he was going to be like a Jeff Flake kind of somebody who didn't run for president, that would be like a U.S. senator, that I could sort of just not, wouldn't have to daily talk about. But Cruz is the top story, and I suspect will be I can't avoid discussing him. But I suspect that part of the problem that Cruz has goes back to something that I think Joe Klein popularized, which is this notion that politicians are the kids who sit in the front of the class and raise their hand that want to answer every question, and journalists are the people sitting in the back of the room throwing spitballs at them. It's like the kind of people who become politicians are different than the kind of journalists tend to be more cynical and kind of whatever, and so I think that some of what journalists don't like about Cruz is this kind of cloying thing where he's like always the kid in the front of the room raising his hand. And Mitt Romney had a little bit of that too, but I'm not saying that they were exactly alike. But I suspect that, like, if you were to dig down into what some of the kind of anti-Cruz reporting you've gotten, somewhere beneath there is a sort of resentment at this kid who's not just smart, but like wants everybody to know it.
Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, he's also, I mean, he's not a particularly concerned human being about pleasing people who aren't his ideological allies. So that's, I mean, part of it is that he's just really aggressive and doesn't really care if people don't like him. So it's which for one, I mean, I disagree with him on quite a few things, but I like him because he's like that. He's fun to write about and fun to talk about. And I mean, and you know, the thing that I would have to say is that he's perhaps the rudest Canadian ever, which is, I'm not sure. I think it's probably a compliment because Canadians could use some like a stern bit of rudeness in their culture.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what accent he has. I can't place it. It's sort of, there's a little
I think he probably whatever it's there is probably an affectation.
Well, it also strikes me as like kind of aristocratic, so like the millionaire on Gilligan's Island too. A sort of aristocratic Texas, but I can't put my finger on it.
I mean, it's probably what a Canadian from Texas sounds like. The poor guy. I mean, it is an honestly fun August story to find out that he will have to wait at least 8 months before he can renounce the citizenship that he didn't know that he had.
Right. Well, what's your take on that? Does this hurt him? Is he eligible to be president?
I haven't seen
is it a big deal? Is it
eligible? I mean, I think, frankly speaking, that if Barack Obama had been born in Kenya, that he still would have been eligible to run for president. So I just don't. I mean, I have not seen a convincing case that someone who was born to an American citizen anywhere is not eligible to run. You can go to like a hardline originalist position, which one of my colleagues, Joel Gerke, reported that there's people in the Rand Paul camp that are sort of subtly floating this idea that, you know, if you want to take an originalist position on the Constitution, that Ted Cruz would perhaps not be eligible because he was born in Canada and that one of his parents wasn't a citizen. I think it sort of requires a degree of intellectual flexibility to really seriously assert that a guy who was born to an American citizen isn't eligible.
Right. Well, the question is, of course, over the terminology natural-born citizen. But regardless of what, I mean, it sounds like you certainly believe he is qualified constitutionally. But putting that aside, looking at the political aspect of it, I mean, Barack Obama didn't have to win a Republican primary. Is there going to be a sizable contingent of people who will be consistent, who thought Obama was not eligible and will also think that Cruz will not be eligible? Or will they be hypocritical? And will it be okay for Cruz to do something, whereas with Obama, it wasn't okay?
I think you'll probably see, I just don't know. I mean, I think birthers will be birthers. They're not smart people, and they shouldn't be treated like they're serious people. But Will Orley Tate, or whatever her name is, go wild with Ted Cruz, probably. I try to pay them as little attention as possible when it's not just sort of a cynical, unfriendly reception, because it's a nonsense issue and shouldn't be terribly concerned about. I mean, I don't think that Barack Obama is a Manchurian candidate. I don't think that Ted Cruz is a Manchurian candidate, so I'm not too worried. I mean, they have American parents. That's awesome.
Right. I want to go back to
that. But I mean, it's a fun thing to talk about, and I thoroughly enjoy it because this is a very boring one. So, but I mean, otherwise, it's just.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, just real quick, because I think it's important. You're talking about how Cruz doesn't want to, doesn't really care what his enemies think, and doesn't want to placate them. I think that's a mistake, and I feel like to be a good politician, you have to kiss some ass, and it's a sign of respect to do it, and it's smart. And I feel like every once in a while these candidates arise who like they're above that. They're above kind of like explaining themselves or trying to win over converts, and they're just going to just tell it like it is and be themselves. And I feel like that's a form of egotism, that they don't really want to sort of humble themselves or lower themselves to take the time. And I feel like it always comes back to bite them. They survive and thrive for a period of a few years, and it looks like they're going to get away with it, and they're actually rewarded for a long time for having this sort of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but eventually, it comes back to bite them.
Well,
and I'm wondering.
That attitude doesn't really grow a movement in any sense. I mean, Ted Cruz is. I think there's a pretty decent case he made that he's one of the smartest people and most astute people in Washington, and he's fairly wisely realized that he can create a substantial movement with himself, following him, and a coalition of ideological allies who are willing to work with him by being himself. I mean, I think he's probably one of the most straightforward politicians in a long while. He's an aggressive type A debater who thinks he's totally right and is not willing to cede an inch, and that I think he's been like that since he was a kid. But you could contrast him to someone, say, like a Chris Christie, who is from a place where he knows that he's a blue state governor instead of someone from a deep red state who recognizes that there are issues where he's going to need to pander and placate, and recognizes that the political coalitions have to sort of be assembled instead of just I don't know. I always think of, Ted Cruz is of the West, and a place where he's from where you have wildfires, and I think Ted Cruz recognizes that sometimes the best thing to do with fire is to let the wind blow and just hang out and watch it all burn, and and that's great because he'll never lose an election in Texas if he wants to stay in the Senate for 30 years. It's just the. Well, no,
I think sure. I think you might underestimate the direction Texas could go.
Oh, there's arguments about it. The angst over will Texas go blue? Maybe it perhaps might, but Texas also really loves its incumbents, and especially ones who understand the culture of the state and who understand the political sensibilities. Even if Texas, say, starts electing more Democrats, there will be Democrats that look a lot like Republicans. Because, the Republicans we have today look a lot like the Democrats that Texas used to elect in the New Deal era, and who look a lot like the Democrats and Republicans who were elected before them. It's just, Texas is an inflexible place. It doesn't change very much, which is part of what makes it the second coolest state in the country. But it's part of why, if Ted Cruz really wants to be in the Senate for a long time, he can probably do it, being just himself.
We'll see. I think he should be more concerned about Texas, but that's just me. But look, going back to the whole placating thing, it sounds like a negative. It sounds like, caving and
well, you've heard the slate pitchy thing, like in defense of pandering, haven't you? Because it's politically it makes a lot of sense. Like
it sounds like something I would.
There's a very compelling case to say that perhaps even I look at it like this. I think that a politician who bothers to pander recognizes that there are voters who are perhaps more willing to listen to him if he speaks in their language and if he offers up concessions to people who might otherwise disagree with him. And I tend to think that politicians who pander are also more open to perhaps recognizing that, maybe there are issues in which I'm wrong. By pandering, maybe that's like a first step into that process. That's where I think that you can have, a GOP that's slightly more ideologically open to probing its own weaknesses. And I don't think Ted Cruz is terribly concerned about having a serious moment of self-reflection. Whereas I think that Christie would perhaps be, concerned enough.
I would just remind, to me, I look to Ronald Reagan, and I compare him to Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater got 38% of the vote, and Ronald Reagan won 2 landslide elections. And, Reagan, after he got, Reagan ran as an outsider, ran against Washington, and when he got to Washington, he went to dinner parties with Kay Graham and others, and courted the D.C. establishment because he understood that they were important and that he would have to work with them. And it doesn't mean that he sold out his ideas or his values, but he built relationships. And I think that's a humble thing to do. For the president to sort of reach out to other people shows a certain humbleness. And it's certainly not something, the egotistical politician wouldn't do that. I think Barack Obama doesn't do it. to the degree that he ought to. So I'm for humbleness, and I feel like there's a lot of ego. But you've mentioned Chris Christie a couple times. He's been in the news.
Of course.
Yes, he's your messiah. If you would talk about the state of Chris Christie.
Well, quite a fan. I'm not even going to pretend that I don't want to talk about 2016 because it's more fun to talk about 2016 than it is to talk about if John Boehner is going to do something about immigration, because we just don't know. So let's chat about, I think that the strongest case for Christie is that he's the person who can present a strong center-right candidate to face off against what's going to be, if Hillary wants it, it's hers. So it's just I would like to, he represents a far more degree of continuity than some of the other candidates in terms of, I would prefer the GOP not reflect upon 2012 and decide the answer is to lurch to the right. I would prefer that it either stay reasonably close to where it is or even perhaps move a little bit to the left on certain things to grow a voting demographic. So we will see. I think Christie represents the effort to, you've written to modernize, not moderate. I prefer to moderate. So that's where we are. And I think Christie will fairly effectively hold strong on some of the key issues. The desire to restrain federal spending, the desire to hold fairly fast on some important social and cultural issues, and the idea that perhaps the Republicans can be competitive again in places like California, New England. And that's because we eventually will have to do that. And I think he represents a good start because it's not so much about rapidly moderating the party or just figuring out ways to present like a 21st century image of the party. It's just that you have to run candidates who can credibly speak to people who aren't of the Tea Party. So we will see. And I have no idea what the heck will happen in the primary.
Right.
And I don't know if Reince will have we'll actually be able to pull off this boycotting of CNN and NBC. We will. I think the biggest part of the mistake of that was that that boycott would extend to, I believe, Telemundo and to another Spanish, and to CNN Espanol, which would be, I don't know, in terms of the whole Latino outreach thing, would not be great to be like, hey, no debate on your station, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So what's your critique of Chris Christie? Because I imagine you're not as much of a fan as I am.
I'm really ambivalent about him.
Are you concerned about him? I guess is a better question I'd ask.
No, I'm not concerned about him because I'm not rooting against him.
You should. It's more fun, isn't it?
Well, there are things about him that concern me.
Okay, like what?
So, for example, he just recently signed this bill that would ban counseling
therapy.
That's the term I'm looking for. And so what bothers me or what concerns me about it is, what does that mean? If what he's trying to do is ban something where you put a kid in a camp where they, electroshock them and give them drugs and sort of against their will try to change them and really screw them up, then I think he's probably right, and that's a good thing to do. But if a kid is struggling with their identity and they go to a Christian counselor, and the counselor, tells them, look, I believe that these urges are wrong, and I would encourage you, then I think you're really in danger of stepping on free speech and religious liberty, and that's where I become very concerned. I haven't nobody's been able to tell me whether or not there's a danger that's what will happen. So Christie, this isn't an anomaly. This is sort of a series. There have been a series of things that he's done that could and should concern social conservatives. I don't necessarily think it's a deal breaker, but it is something that I am concerned about, because I'm very concerned about free speech and religious liberty, and I hope that we don't have a situation where there's a chilling effect on free speech. If somebody is struggling with this issue and they want this type of therapy, Should government be involved in telling them they can't get it?
We'll see. I mean, I imagine if there is to be, I'm always sympathetic to the concern of. I generally would prefer the government not tell the clergy what to do. I think that we have a broadly understood separation of the church and state for a pretty good reason. But from what I have heard, I'm not terribly concerned about the free speech implications of this gay conversion therapy ban. I think it was probably it was an incredibly astute political move because it allows you to sort of do what's the Clinton term, the triangulation. Like it allows you to say, hey, I'm going to hold fast on what Christie believes is an important issue. I mean, he has essentially his politically speaking, he's exactly where on gay marriage Barack Obama was a year ago. And he wants gay people to be able to enjoy good, happy lives as American citizens and to be afforded all their rights. He just simply thinks that marriage is a centuries-old institution that should be broadly respected and shouldn't be so quickly changed. But he's also the governor of New Jersey, and so there's going to be he has to make these. I don't know. I don't know if it's a concession or if it's like just a reflection of reality. I mean, it's. You mentioned when I've heard about these gay conversion therapies. I mean, it's just. I don't know. I think it's kind of a nightmare to put these kids through that. I mean, it seems to be relatively traumatic, and I think that the state probably has a compelling interest in trying
it depends it depends what conversion therapy means. If it means sending them off to some camp where they get electrodes stuck in them against their will, that's one thing. If it's a kid who goes to a counselor and is struggling with something and asks for advice, then it's entirely another thing.
It's a legal statute. I mean, we'll have to dig through it. I imagine that it will receive a court challenge either way, so we will pretty quickly see. We pay old people a lot of money. Well, not a lot of money, but like a reasonable amount of money and societal respect to think through these issues and to make sort of reasonable decisions about them. So we'll find out.
You mentioned triangulation and you mentioned Clinton earlier, and it does occur to me that Bill Clinton won as a new Democrat, and it was because we were in, the Democrats we were in the era of Reagan, and Bill Clinton was able to sort of win, but under the paradigm of the Reagan Revolution. And if Christie becomes president, I think it probably is maybe a concession that we're now like in the age of Obama, and that the only way that Republicans can still be elected president, but they're going to be governing under a more liberal paradigm. And so in a sense, it's a concession of defeat, even if we manage to elect, I consider myself a conservative, not a Republican per se, but even if Republicans can elect a president. Is that a fair assessment?
Probably, yeah. I mean, the GOP hasn't won a presidential election under normal conditions since 2000. I mean, Bush won in 2004 because of a combination of nationalism and a really cynical anti-gay marriage campaign in Ohio.
And they lost the popular vote in 2000. So
yeah, so I mean, it's kind of been a while. I mean, it's the last real victory was in '88. So
that's a long time ago.
Yeah, and President Obama has fairly successfully assembled a coalition that I think will hold fairly fast. A coalition of the young, primarily of young women, a coalition of racial and ethnic minorities that will hold pretty fast, and the GOP seems almost determined to tell minorities to essentially see it, no thanks. And there have been the analyses that say this will not last past Obama, but I would suspect that it probably will, particularly if the Republican reaction to this is to go further away, to pass more laws that tighten voting, to pass more laws that are that adversely affect the working poor and the non-working poor, that are not great for young people, that benefit primarily old people. So it's just I don't know, maybe I don't want to be too much of a Beltway Burkean, as my friends would say, but it's just that there are some things that will have to be done, and there probably does need to be a concession made that, yes, we are, the next Republican president will be an Obama Republican of some sort, whether that is a concession that Obamacare is here to stay, whether that is a more aggressive outreach to say.
Well, that's and I have to tell you, I mean, I think people have wrongly, accused me of being a complete Rubio.
Lewis, you love Rubio.
Well, I do like him as a candidate because I'll tell you one of the reasons why. Because I think that he has the Thatcher maxim: first you win the argument, then you win the vote. Mm-hmm. And I feel like Christie could succeed as a president under the sort of Obama paradigm, though, in the age of Obama, through the force of his will and toughness, and by compromising on certain things and fighting on certain things, and that his force of Christie's personality could push things through, and he would be a compromiser sometimes and a fighter sometimes, and I think he could be a good president. But I think that if you want to change the paradigm, Rubio has the rhetorical ability to teach and to bring along the American people, and to do it in Spanish and English. So that, to me, that would be a good argument for Rubio as someone who could appeal to. He could possibly win a general election by appealing to more moderate.
What paradigm are we trying to change here? I mean, I don't think Rubio is, in meaningful ways, is much different than Bush. I mean, in terms of policy positions, in terms of outreach to Latino voters. Maybe if you really want to aggressively change a paradigm, you go with a Paul, who is terrifying, or a Cruz, who is also terrifying. Because, I mean, these are people who would aggressively change meaningful.
When do they
meaningful
teach?
Bits of public policy. So,
well, look, I think Rand Paul would change Rand Paul has the potential to change the paradigm. It's risky, but Rand Paul could be attractive to a lot of civil libertarians, people who think of themselves as liberals in some cases, young people. I don't think Cruz has that appeal. I think Cruz is very popular amongst the base, but I think Rand Paul could change the paradigm, but it's a huge risk. Because it would be a reordering of the conservative coalition. But I think Rubio could change the paradigm.
I mean, it would be a demolishing of the conservative coalition.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be.
But I think Rubio could change the paradigm without a radical reordering, but he could do it because, unlike George W. Bush, Rubio can teach the American people and bring them along like Reagan did in a way that Bush couldn't. That's my argument.
I mean, maybe. We'll have to see. I don't think that in most ways that Rubio is much different than a Bush, which I think is perhaps commendable because when Bush won a presidential election, won two in fact, so that means pretty good. I mean, it's perhaps to be said that Bush could have
one of the biggest problems.
Think about what he ran on in 1998 and 99. He ran as a sort of a cautious, not too foreign policy aggressive president who wanted to do modest domestic reforms. And then 9/11 happened and the rest of it changed. It's sort of strange to remember what he was elected on. And people remember George Bush standing on the aircraft carrier in a fighter suit.
Right.
He won re-election as a center-right governor from Texas who sort of promised a modest a relative continuity from Clinton. Who had continuity from his father, who had continuity from Ronald Reagan, and then 9/11 and Iraq completely reordered the conservative coalition.
Yeah, it's really a shame. It would have been very interesting. We do these alternate histories, and it would be very interesting to see what kind of a president George W. Bush might have been, and would he have been reelected, and would he have been the education president or a compassionate conservative. But I want to go back, to the Rubio thing, because I think that, one of the biggest criticisms of Bush has to be, putting aside policy, but one of the biggest criticisms politically was that he wasn't a good communicator. And I think that's a huge difference. I think Rubio is a vastly superior communicator to George W. Bush, and I just don't think you can underestimate that when it comes to winning the argument and persuading voters that your ideas are right. I think Bush pushed through a lot of things, including the run up to the war in Iraq, without explaining it, without persuading the public. And that's a huge mistake. Even if you win the battle, if you haven't persuaded the public first, eventually they'll turn on you.
Sure, I mean, but he also won in 2004. I mean, so he didn't do a very job of explaining. And I mean, there will be books eventually written on this that are going to be very good, that are going to do a better job of explaining things. Because I mean, I was 14 when that started, so my memory is a little fuzzy on the subject. But I'm skeptical of Rubio, because I just don't. I think to a certain extent, I mean, he may be a fine communicator, but the problem for the Republicans isn't so much they're not good at communicating; it's that our policies, as I will write over and over and over again, just don't really match up well with the concerns of the middle class right now. Because the world has changed. It's not. We are not in the era of Reagan, because the United States is no longer in the 80s. So, as long as the Republican Party doesn't respond to that change in dynamic, I think we're just going to be in trouble. And we can communicate and sell ideas as much as we want, but if they're basically the same ideas, we're in a problem. So I'm going to hashtag that real keeping, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's frustrating.
Well, look,
that's the life we're
in. To me, like, conservatism still works. Now, there may be specific policy details. Like, maybe we should talk.
Why don't we talk about what Michael Strain has been offering? He wrote a great thing. I mean, he's an AEI fellow. He wrote a thing on like what conservatives could do right now to offer help to the long-term unemployed, because that is perhaps the
right.
The fact that we have a substantial subset of Americans who have been unemployed for a very long time and whose skills are degrading and who are quickly becoming non-competitive in the workforce, and who are being increasingly drawn to disability, which is it permanently removes you from the workforce. It puts a person on the dole. It's very expensive for our federal budget. I mean, that is something that perhaps we could do. I mean, the idea that perhaps we need to significantly increase or do like cost sharing with employers, or we need to create big incentives for people to move to areas where there is job demand instead of areas where unemployment remains high. I mean, there are conservative ideas. They're just getting nothing.
Well, that's my point. These ideas are not unconservative. They may be unconventional, but they're not unconservative, and there's no reason why we couldn't champion them. There are a lot of good ideas out there that I think are conservative. They require an interest in governing. They require creativity and a willingness to drop some of the dogma that isn't necessarily, conservative, but it's become, our traditions, more sort of modern era traditions. Like you've talked about the payroll tax instead of the income tax, things like that can be addressed.
Can we hop real quick into I'm sort of curious what your stance is on this debate between the reformist conservatives and the libertarian populists. My colleague Con Carroll wrote a really sort of a very nicely handled and pretty concise article yesterday in which he said that most of the political interests and priorities tend to reasonably to align between people like a Dalfit and a Ben Domenech or a Tim Carney, in the sense that we want to create a center-right coalition that removes rent-seeking, that sort of actively seeks to disengage the fact that people can use political power and access to enrich themselves, to enrich their children, to siphon off resources from a productive public. So I'm curious where you stand on this.
So, I mean, I'm with the populist libertarian populists. I'm with them on things that I've always been with them on, such as the notion that, it's bad when big business colludes with big government. And I think that Carney has been absolutely right about that issue for a long time. Big business likes big government because they like regulation. Because regulation,
because they can handle them, and small businesses can't.
Exactly, they have the resources.
Yeah.
So I'm with them on that. My concern is that I suspect, not Carney necessarily. Well, first I will say a place where I disagree with Carney. I don't like the populist rhetoric. I don't like playing the victim.
Right. I forgot about that.
And so I don't like the populist rhetoric like, we need to get those fat cats, I think that's sort of a sort of negative form of populism. I would be much more positive in uplifting in my populism. There's a way to do it that's positive, and there's a way to do it that's sort of victimhood and negative. But speaking to the policy, putting aside the rhetoric, my concern is with the libertarian thing, and I am libertarian on a lot of issues. Drones, NSA, snooping. I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about free speech and civil liberties. But I suspect that a lot of the enthusiasm about the libertarian thing is also an effort to sort of drop social issues from the conservative coalition.
Maybe.
There's a sense that we need to declare a truce on social issues, and that part of it does concern me.
I mean, maybe, but I mean, I think if people, I think this would, the Libertarian Coalition is pretty swiftly becoming, it seems to be, they're like, yeah, gay marriage is happening, but also young people persistently are reasonably pro-life, and most of my even hardliner libertarian friends are pretty staunchly pro-life. I think those two are not necessarily incompatible, so we'll have to see on that, but I mean, I love watching Tim Carney on Twitter going after people for wanting to effectively to kill infants. So it's I think that you can see a differentiation between in social issues between the issue of gay rights versus the issue of the rights of unborn children. So we'll have to see. I'm still pretty skeptical of the lib pop issue because I don't think it. I think the initial response that Carney got, which was that it just doesn't broadly appeal to the real voting priorities of a substantial subset of the population. These seem to be, yes, these are good rhetorical points, and these are probably good internal critiques of the Republican Party as a whole, because it's a big, broad coalition of interests, and that having a strong libertarian argument against cronyism is good for the party, and as a reflection, good for the country as a whole. I think the broad thing is that the middle class is crunched, and that people are not seeing their lives and their financial well-being meaningfully improve, and they don't see their job prospects being good, and young kids are being increasingly crushed by debt that they're told they need to take on in order to be to have a bright future, and old people are increasingly concerned that their current the standard of living will be terrible, and people can't keep up with the rising cost of healthcare. So I think that's probably the last thing is probably the most meaningful, which is that until we figure out how to meaningfully constrain spending on healthcare, the rest of it's going to be pretty terrible, because the reason that employers aren't paying people more is because healthcare costs them more, and the reason that employers are skeptical about hiring is because they have to provide people with health insurance, and that costs money. So that's the big one. I think if the GOP can meaningfully come up with an alternative to Obamacare in the next 5 to 10 years, that'll be perhaps the biggest part. I mean, there are things Tom Price has floated a plan that I think is, it's not bad. I mean, it's just, as with all plans, the problem with alternatives to Obamacare is that you have to have legislators who have an interest in passing it, and I don't see it. I mean, we're aggressively. I mean, we're Heritage Action's dropping ads against Republicans who don't want to defund a program that they can't defund. It's insane, and I don't know I don't even know how to respond to it. It's like, oh, you want to defund a mandatory program that will get funded whether or not you fund it. Okay, like, cool, great. It's a great rhetorical point that does absolutely nothing. But no, you could. I mean, here's the thing: if you really hate Obamacare, you could also make the argument that we should be suing to force them to implement the individual measures. Right. Well, it's sort of like make go ahead out of spite. If you think the program is going to be terrible, you want it to be implemented as quickly as possible so that people feel the negative effects of it and react against it. But I think the problematic part is that if they get these exchanges to work, people will probably like it, and it will have a negative trajectory for the economic well-being of the country, but it's not in a way that people will personally and immediately feel it, and not in a way that you can quickly measure. I mean, it's one of those where, I mean, America is historically been a very dynamic country, and it will make us slightly less dynamic, which is not a good thing, but it's not something that most people will personally feel in a way that is meaningful. It will have on the aggregate, it will change things, but on the individual level, probably not. Which means that
I think you're right. I think you're right too. But the very people who are insisting that we defund Obamacare would tell you that this is a horrible thing and it's going to collapse under its own weight, and that the day it's implemented, it's going to be obvious that it's a disaster. I mean, I think
that they probably either being slightly dishonest, or that they're just not really thinking about it very hard. Yeah, it can't be both things. It can't be something that is going to obviously fail and something that we can't let possibly get implemented because it might work.
Right.
I mean, that's the
what really bothers me about this debate is the sense that if you disagree, I think we can, we all agree that Obamacare is horrible. I personally think it's unconstitutional, no matter what John Roberts thinks.
Tax.
But what bothers me is the notion that if you just disagree strategically about the best way to fight it, you're a sellout and you're a traitor.
Right. Well, couldn't a good starter be let's not primary each other over strategies to attack Obamacare? Maybe an internal truce would be a good start.
Yeah. Maybe I really, really hate Obamacare, but I think that the best way to get rid of it would be to elect a Republican senator and a Republican president.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And that's my strategy.
Yeah.
But I'm a sellout and a wimp and a traitor if that's what I believe.
Right, you're clearly a sellout because, it's so obvious that if we just defund it and really aggressively push it and threaten the shutdown government, that President Obama will happily change a law named after him now. His signature achievement as President of the United States is that he passed the Affordable Care Act. It is not the finishing jewel of the Democratic coalition, but it's the biggest change to health policy in the last 40 years, and he pulled it off, amidst a pretty nasty recession, and he somehow snagged 60 votes for this act, and but he will happily change it if only Republicans are tougher on him,
right?
Because
and of course
we control the Senate too, so it's helpful. We're totally going to do it.
Yeah. Well, the other problem too is Republicans don't really have an alternative. I mean,
like I said, there are credible plans, but we don't have any votes.
Right. I think having catastrophic care, where you can pay a low deductible, but prevent bankruptcy or catastrophe, selling across state lines. All these things are good ideas, but if you start to put them into an actual bill that could pass, possibly, maybe you throw in, stay on until you're 26, you can stay on your parents' account. All of a sudden, that becomes a deal breaker. So I don't even know if the Republican coalition right now would be capable of crafting a health care bill.
They've been animated for 3 years by this certainty that we can just get rid of what we have. And we lost. We lost. You may disagree with John Roberts, but the highest court in the United States just decided that it was constitutional. And then we lost in November, and that was perhaps the answer was simply that Romney was not the person to run against the Affordable Care Act. I think that's a fairly credible argument, but unfortunately, he was the candidate, and we didn't win.
And who would have been better? And who would have been better? Honestly,
nobody.
Romney was a horrible and incredibly flawed candidate, as I pointed out numerous times. But I don't know that I don't know that there was anybody else on the, who ran who would have beaten Barack Obama.
Mitch Daniels. But no, I agree. I was saddened that my, at the time, favorite governor didn't run. But you just, politically speaking, we lost on Obamacare, and there will be an opportunity come 2016 if we win the election to make significant tweaks to it, and to perhaps if it really does, if it actually is implementing as poorly as people are predicting, maybe it can be repealed or replaced, but you're probably never going to get rid of the individual mandate. You're probably never going to get rid of allowing kids to stay on for longer, and you're probably never going to get rid of the idea that people with pre-existing conditions should not be denied by insurers. And our healthcare system became significantly more socialist in 2009. and that's probably done. It's just that I think people are warming up to the idea that the right to access health insurance is probably going to be considered an inalienable right in the United States.
Well, and I think that's
challenge
the
for Republicans is to keep that a
that is the fundamental debate
rather than single payer. So
that is the fundamental debate that we sort of had, but I don't think it's settled. I mean, is healthcare a right? Should healthcare be a right? And I think the vast majority of conservatives would say it's a responsibility, not a right. But have the American people decided that it is a right? And is that irreversible? And this is the big fundamental debate, of course, that we almost never talk about anymore. But we do have to wrestle with that question. And if we believe it's a responsibility and not a right, then maybe we should be selling that and teaching that idea and explaining that idea rather than expending all of our energy on other things.
Or rather than primary our own candidates.
Possibly.
I mean, I almost vomited in my mouth when I saw that they're going to primary Lamar Alexander in Tennessee, and I mean, it's laughable that we're primarying Mitch McConnell. I mean, it's fantastic in its absurdity, but here we are. I mean, it's the problem with a political movement that the primary animus of it is opposing the Affordable Care Act is that when you can't get rid of the Affordable Care Act, you just eat your own. So, and that's what's happening right now. So. Well,
so much of what we do is based on it's not what we believe in, it's what we're against. And look, I think that part of what's happening now is that society has changed and there are no leaders anymore. We don't respect leaders. Leaders no longer have the carrots and sticks that they used to have. Everybody has a megaphone. Everybody has a microphone. There are outside groups now that are more important than leadership. And this change just happened to coincide with the Republican Party's collapse and the chaos within the Republican Party. So I think it's hit the Republicans especially hard. But there is chaos, and it's unclear who's in charge.
Part of it is that, I mean, this is your herding cats thesis, and that you can't do that. I mean, it's I think it's just that the Republican Party is out of power, and it's things are becoming more decentralized, which is broadly speaking a good thing because you want as many decisions as possible made on the most local level possible, which is, I mean, according to our principles, that's a good thing. It's just adjusting to that is difficult, and it is difficult for someone who is a senator to say, hey, like, I made tough votes because, you know, we're trying to be a nationally competitive party.
Right.
So I don't know.
There's 435 members of Congress, you know, a couple hundred Republicans in the House. If 99% of them say the right thing, but one of them says something incredibly inflammatory, that one thing becomes the media narrative.
Yeah, it becomes.
And it's partly because of media bias, but it's partly because of the world that we live in. Everybody's got a blog, everybody's got Twitter, everybody's got a camera. So it's this insatiable appetite for information and for nobody follows the leader. Everybody wants to be a free agent nation, and that has a downside. But I think it's hit the Republican Party especially hard because it happened to have sort of peaked or at least reached this level at a time when they were already sort of in chaos and leaderless anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if all else fails, I mean, we'll have Tom Cotton in 2024, and we will be good. But I'm ready to wait. Happily willing to wait. But it might be a while. So I don't know. I think it's just the August doldrums, and that we probably just need to quit being so emo about it. But
we live in interesting times. Hey, before we go, we'll get off this because I think we're both ornery, and when it comes to the GOP and the state of the conservative movement. But Al Jazeera America launched yesterday, and you know, apparently they got off to an interesting start, but there is also talk that this is like the biggest launch of a cable news network since Fox News, and I think '96. What is your take on this? On, you know, is it going to thrive or is it going to sort of flounder?
Well, we will see. I mean, one of the reasons that Fox News thrived is because there wasn't anything like it. I mean, it essentially demolished what at the time had been fairly stable media environment, and which is in terms of what I would prefer, I think it was probably a good thing. I just don't know like what niche Al Jazeera really fills. I mean, there are plenty of journalists out there. I don't. Perhaps they compete with CNN. Perhaps they compete with MSNBC. Perhaps they. I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm going to have a lot of fun making fun of a news network that is owned and funded by the government of Qatar. I mean, it's going to be whenever they go on about like human rights abuses, it's going to be like, well, look at home, guys. Like, congratulations. And then I'm going to be like, oh crap, we fund that, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think
it's always good when people hire more journalists. I think that broadly speaking, that you want more people reporting the news because it offers people more perspectives, and it allows the more people you have professionally paid to do it, the more they can call BS on each other, and that's good. I think that's probably the best thing in the last 20 years is that you have a lot of reporters who can quickly say you're wrong, and that's false and unhelpful, and then offer a version of the truth that might be more helpful to people. So,
right.
It's going to be fun.
Well, I mean, I think
I
one of the
encourage
things
everyone to check out
is...
the Al Jazeera TV shows hashtag because it's really fun. Not normally a huge fan, but Matthew Vadum had some really funny ones. So touche, Matt. Congratulations. It's good to see it launch. It's good to see publications hiring journalists.
Right.
I have no idea what to expect from it. It's I don't think it's going to be like current or any of those things because actually it technically is current, isn't it? But I think it'll succeed because they have a lot of money to throw around, and that this is about prestige and influence more than it is about making profit, and that Qatar wants to be a world player, and that this is the way it sees into it, which is probably pretty savvy. So we'll see. I also just don't think Americans are going to watch it, so it probably doesn't matter.
Well, they're supposedly...
they could steal viewers from Chris Hayes, but I don't know how many they're going to steal, so...
I mean, they're trying to be like the serious news network. So, I guess the assumption is that Fox brought in this edutainment thing, and the other networks had to copy it to survive, and MSNBC, which had been sort of a liberal-leaning mainstream outlet, and became an overtly leftist outlet for the most part.
Not even leftist, just like overtly democratic. I mean, it was I think the funniest thing is how much actual leftists hate MSNBC. That's true.
It's just some of them do.
I do. It's like the line when people call Matt Iglesias a communist, and then actually, I always, whenever this happens, I'm like, oh yes, and then I go and like just casually watch the Twitter feeds of the actual Marxists that I follow, and I'm like, oh yes, because
well, that's the thing. It's like, well, it's like the way that liberals think that like Mitch McConnell is a hardcore conservative. It's the same phenomenon where, and look, there are some MSNBC, I still love Morning Joe, I still like Daily Rundown, but some of the stuff, I mean, Ed Schultz and Reverend Al Sharpton, come on.
Lawrence O'Donnell, Chris Matthews, I mean, it's a star-studded cast, yeah. Changing
Chris
the world
Matthews,
4 viewers at a time. I mean,
the Chris Matthews thing is the most disappointing to me because he used to be, and he still has moments of brilliance. He really loves politics, and he really knows politics, and he can be fabulous. And I feel like he had to, maybe, I don't know if he had to or he did, but, he was really, there was a time when he was really hard on Bill Clinton.
I don't think that was probably terribly hard. I mean, he was a big
people don't remember that because it was a decade ago.
There's more than that.
I used to work at this conservative think tank or organization called the Leadership Institute. Chris Matthews came and spoke there. I mean, he had worked for Democrats like Tip O'Neill and Jimmy Carter, but I mean, there was a time when he was a pretty kind of old school conservative Democrat, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So he has evolved, and I don't know if that's a personal evolving or if that was to keep pace with the network. But in any event, I think Al Jazeera is going to try to be like what
like it's serious
cable news used to be,
or what? Like, I mean, if they want to be serious, I mean, that's sort of what. I mean, CNN is still a fairly serious organization, and the network nightly news, those remain pretty serious things, and it's just I don't know like what the heck they're gonna watch. Partly because I just don't like. especially young viewers don't care to watch a guy in an ill-fitting suit talk about serious politics. They just it's not there. But I mean, like I said, I don't think it's really a money-making venture, and I don't think that's the point of it. So we will see. I would predict really bad ratings because there's just people at this point I think have ample viewing choices and have already made their decisions. So
Right.
and I mean, the best part of watching TV is you get to actually watch people. So unless they're hiring knockouts, I mean, I just don't see it.
All right,
But-
man. Well, thank you for filling in this the last 2 weeks. We
Of
appreciate
course,
it.
I mean, it's good to have it's good to have a session where that leftist Bill wasn't allowed to speak. So
Yes.
tell him that we're silencing his views and that he lost. I wanted to quickly end by calling him a corporatist, just to end. Hi, Bill. Thanks for letting me fill your seat today. So
Excellent. Well, so how can people keep up with your goings on? And
my Twitter handle is listed below. So
all right.
follow me. I don't particularly. It doesn't matter. But thanks for having me on, Matt. It was a good time.
All right, buddy. Talk to you later.
All right. See you.